You know, usually when we talk about a dictionary definition, there is this expectation of absolute precision.
Right, it feels very binary, like math.
Yeah, it feels like engineering or something. You open up an app or a heavy hardcover dictionary, you type in a word, and the page shows that clean, bold text. The reference guide just points a metaphorical finger and says, well, that is what this sequence of letters means.
You want a single static concept. You want the definition to just sit still for you.
Defined or undefined.
Yeah.
Right. It is clean. We like things to be visible, to be categorized neatly in a box that we can easily comprehend.
But then you open up a massive multi-volume ancient language lexicon, and suddenly that precision tool kind of shatters.
It really does. We're looking at a linguistic landscape that is, well, honestly murky and wild. You realize that a single word can contain centuries of shifting human experience. Welcome to Reformed Thinking.
Yeah, glad to be here for this one.
For this deep dive, we are examining a very dense stack of linguistic sources focusing on a comprehensive Hebrew lexicon entry. We are setting out on a mission today for you, the listener. We want to uncover the fascinating history and the massive theological weight of a single biblical Hebrew root word, which is Tsalach.
And it is a word that appears dozens of times in the biblical text, yet its meaning shifts in ways that completely challenge our modern categories. We are dealing with an ancient Semitic language, which operates on entirely different rules than English.
And here is the hook for you. This is the central mystery we are going to look into today. How did an ancient word that originally meant to split wood or to force an entry become the primary biblical term for success and prosperity?
It is quite the leap, isn't it?
It is a massive leap. I mean, think about that. You go from swinging an axe, chopping a log in half, to having a prosperous career or a successful military campaign.
Those concepts feel worlds apart to us today.
They really do. But in the ancient mind, they are intrinsically linked. So we're going to trace that line today, and I think you will find it completely changes how you view the concept of success.
The evolution of this specific root is one of the most striking examples of semantic development in the ancient Near East. It forces us to take off our 21st century glasses, so to speak.
Right. We have to view reality through the eyes of an ancient, agrarian, and highly physical culture.
Okay, let's unpack this. We need to start right at the beginning with the etymological puzzle.
That is a great place to start.
When scholars look at an ancient Hebrew word, they do not just look at the biblical text in isolation. They look at the surrounding languages, the cognates, to see how the neighbors were using the same root.
That is correct. We have to examine the broader Semitic language family to get our bearings. In Semitic languages, words are generally built on a root of 3 consonants.
And for our word today, what are those letters? The root is spelled with 3 letters, Sod, Lamed, and Chet. To understand what those 3 letters meant before they were ever written down in the biblical texts we have today, linguists look at sister languages.
So, like, how did the neighbors use it?
Precisely. When we look at Jewish Aramaic and Syriac, which are closely related languages spoken in the same general region, the verb Tsalach can mean to split or to cleave.
I want to pause on that for a second. The history of how scholars have treated this word is fascinating in itself, right?
It really reveals a lot about the scholars themselves. If you go back to older lexicons, like the famous Jacenius lexicon or the early editions of the Brown Driver Briggs lexicon from the late 19th century, you see a lot of focus on this physical action.
Yeah, the Brown Driver Briggs lexicon actually separated the word into 2 entirely different roots. They categorized root 2 as meaning to rush into or to penetrate, and root 2 as meaning to advance or to prosper.
Yes, and the reason they did that reveals those assumptions of earlier linguists. To those older scholars, the idea of splitting wood violently and the idea of succeeding just seemed incompatible.
Like they couldn't exist in the same thought.
Right. They assumed there must have been 2 different words that just happened to sound the same. Perhaps they derived from different ancient dialects, and they converged in spelling by pure accident.
It is what we call homonyms in English,
Yeah.
right? Like a tree bark and a dog's bark. 2 totally different things.
Spot on. That was the prevailing theory for a long time.
Because to the Victorian era mind, success is a gentlemanly pursuit. It is about polite society, climbing the ranks, building a business. It is not about swinging a hatchet or sweating in a field.
No, not at all. But modern linguistic scholarship has shifted significantly away from that split root theory. Scholars like Emil Puch and Joshua Blau argue strongly that we are not looking at 2 different words at all.
Okay, so they think it is all connected.
Yes, they believe we are looking at one single root with a unified semantic development. And the evidence for this comes from expanding our view to other ancient texts.
What kind of text are we talking about here?
Well, for instance, in Old South Arabic and Phoenician, the cognates of this word clearly mean to thrive. You even see it in Phoenician personal names.
Oh, wow. Like they named their kids after this word.
They did. Parents would name their child incorporating the root Tsalach, hoping the child would thrive or prosper in life.
I love that. It is like naming your kid success or thrive. It shows how culturally significant the concept was to them.
It does. But we also have this fascinating Egyptian Aramaic text mentioned in the sources.
Right. The text known as Ahikar 125. Can you set the scene for what this document actually is?
The Ahikar Papyri are ancient wisdom texts discovered in Elephantine, which is an island in the Nile River in Egypt. They tell the story of a legendary wise counselor named Ahikar.
Okay, so it is a story, and what happens in line 125?
In line 125 of this particular document, we see a form of the word Tsalach used in a highly debated context. For a long time, based on the Aramaic understanding, some scholars translated it as someone chopping wood.
Which fits the old dictionary definition of splitting or cleaving. Right.
It does. But more recent analysis by Puch suggests a different translation. He translates it as setting wood on fire.
Wait, setting it on fire?
Yes. The picture painted in the papyrus is someone stealthily igniting logs in the dark without being seen. It is a proverb about a specific type of action.
Okay. Chopping wood versus setting wood on fire. On the surface, those seem like two totally different activities.
They do seem different, sure.
I mean, if you tell me to chop wood and I set it on fire, you are going to be pretty upset. But when you think about the physics of what is happening, both are intensely physical, aggressive actions.
And both involve a forceful change of state. Whether you are swinging an axe to split a log or introducing a spark to ignite a fire, you are forcing a reaction.
You are making something happen against its will, almost.
Yes, you are penetrating a solid barrier. Wood is hard. It resists change. The axe head has to break the structural integrity of the timber.
The fire has to consume and break down the chemical structure of the wood.
Exactly that. And this is how scholars trace the semantic development of Tsalach. You start with a highly concrete, physical action.
I want to make sure we trace this line clearly for the listener. How does a language move from swinging an axe to getting a promotion at work?
It happens gradually through metaphor. The language moves from splitting or forcing an entry to the broader concept of penetrating.
Okay, from physical splitting to penetrating. Then what?
From penetrating, it shifts to the idea of moving forward or making progress against resistance. And finally, if you are continuously moving forward, overcoming barriers, you arrive at the abstract concept of succeeding.
It makes total sense when you lay it out sequentially like that. It is a progression from physical force to abstract result.
It is a very natural evolution for a language to take.
I'm trying to think of a real-world equivalent for you, the listener, to hold on to. Think about the English phrase, breaking through.
That is a perfect parallel.
If I say I am going to physically break through a brick wall, you picture a sledgehammer. You picture rubble, dust, sweat, and brute force.
You see a very physical struggle.
But if I say, I finally had a breakthrough in my career, or our research team made a massive breakthrough, you do not picture a sledgehammer anymore.
Right. You picture a promotion or a scientific discovery.
Yeah, a massive mental leap. You move from a physical barrier to an abstract success, but the underlying aggression of the word remains.
What's fascinating here is that the English word success comes from Latin roots. We have sub, meaning next to or under, and ceder, meaning to go or to yield.
So it literally means to come after or to follow closely.
Yes. In English, success is about a sequence of events falling into place. It is orderly, it is logical.
That feels very safe and predictable.
It does. But the Hebrew concept of success, rooted in Tsalach, is much more aggressive. It is not just about things following a logical, neat sequence.
So it is about a penetrating force that refuses to be stopped by any obstacle.
That is the core idea, yes. A forceful breaking through.
A force that refuses to be stopped. That is such a vivid, almost violent image. It completely strips away the polite veneer we put on the idea of success.
It really shifts the paradigm.
And it perfectly sets up the next phase of our investigation. Because when we leave the broader ancient Near East and look at how this word first appears in the biblical text itself, we're not looking at human careers or financial prosperity.
No, we are looking at divine action.
We're moving away from the etymology and into the sudden rushing reality of how God acts.
To understand this transition, we need to look at the grammatical structure of biblical Hebrew. Hebrew verbs operate in different stems or patterns.
And what do these stems actually do to the word?
Well, they modify the intensity, the voice, or the causative nature of the action. The simplest, most basic stem is called the Qal stem.
So that is like the baseline version of the verb.
Yes, it represents simple active voice. In the biblical text, the simple active form of Tsalach occurs 25 times.
Let's look at one of the most physical, concrete usages that is still very much alive in this basic stem. You see it in 2 Samuel 19.18.
Yes. The context there is a chaotic scene regarding King David. Absalom's rebellion has ended, and David is returning to claim his throne.
And the text uses Tsalach to describe people moving aggressively toward the Jordan River to meet him.
Right, and translators wrestle heavily with this specific verse. Some render it to cut through the river, others say to rush toward or to storm in.
It is a tough one to nail down.
It is. One prominent scholar, Hertzberg, translates it as to storm in, while Pusch maintains the idea of forcing entry into the river.
The focus is on rapid, sudden movement with considerable energy. They are not taking a leisurely stroll to the water's edge. They are plunging in.
They are acting with intense urgency.
But the most striking use of this basic active stem is not about groups of men rushing rivers. It is about the Spirit of God.
This is where it gets highly theological.
The lexicon points out a heavy concentration of this word in the books of Judges and 1 Samuel, and it is entirely connected to the charismatic equipping of individuals.
Yes, the text says the Spirit of God Tsalach upon a person. This is where the translation to force entry becomes incredibly significant.
And where that sledgehammer analogy really holds weight.
Absolutely. Look at the stories of Samson in Judges 14 and 15. Samson is walking toward the vineyards of Timnah, and suddenly he is confronted by a roaring young lion.
Just a normal Tuesday walk, right?
Right. But the text says the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him. The Hebrew verb is Tsalach. The Spirit forced entry into his reality.
The text says he tore the lion apart with his bare hands as one tears a young goat. It is astonishingly violent.
It is a sudden, explosive outcome. Samson did not train for this.
He didn't go to a seminar on lion taming, that's for sure.
No, he didn't. We see the exact same verb used with King Saul in 1 Samuel 10. Samuel tells Saul that he will meet a group of prophets.
And then what happens?
Samuel says the Spirit of the Lord will rush upon him, Tsalach, and he will be turned into another man. And it happens. He falls into a manic prophetic state.
It completely overrides his normal behavior.
It does, and we see it again with David in 1 Samuel 16, when Samuel takes the horn of oil and anoints him as king.
The text says the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward.
Yes, it is that same forceful, active verb.
So we have to talk about the prepositions here.
Yeah.
Because the lexicon specifically highlights the little connecting words used in these sentences, and they seem to carry a lot of theological weight.
Yes. The Hebrew prepositions are crucial for establishing the direction of the force.
How so?
When the text describes the Spirit rushing, it uses the preposition al, which means over or upon, or it uses el, which means to or into.
So the Spirit rushes over Samson, and the Spirit forces entry into David.
Correct. Those are the specific directions given by the text.
I have to ask, why is that grammatical distinction so critical for our understanding? It feels like we are splitting hairs over a tiny word, like on or into.
Because it indicates that this force is entirely external. The energy, the momentum, the capacity to achieve the goal does not originate from within the human subject.
Oh, I see. Samson didn't just dig deep and find his inner strength.
Exactly. Saul did not meditate his way into a prophetic frenzy. An external, irresistible force descended over them, took control of their faculties, and drove them toward a specific, immediate goal.
It is a sovereign God moving with aggressive purpose. It is almost terrifying when you think about it.
It is definitely not a tame concept.
We like to think of God's presence as a warm blanket or a comforting whisper. But Tsalach describes a divine home invasion.
That is a very stark way to put it, but linguistically it fits.
God breaks down the door of their normal human limitations. Which brings to mind the reference in Amos 5.6. The lexicon notes a highly debated verse there.
Yes, where the prophet warns the people to seek the Lord, lest he break out like fire. The debate among scholars there is quite intense.
What are they debating?
Well, some scholars want to invent a completely different root word just for this specific verse, suggesting it means to ignite based on some distant Akkadian words.
They just want to smooth out the text to make it less aggressive.
Right. But linguists who hold to a unified root for Tsalach argue that it retains its core meaning. to break in.
So the prophet Amos is saying, "Seek the Lord, lest he break into the house of Joseph like a fire."
And that it devours with no one to quench it?
Fire does not ask permission. It does not knock on the front door and wait for an invitation. It forces entry.
It consumes whatever is in its path to achieve its end.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, what does this say about human agency versus divine sovereignty?
It is a huge question. When the Spirit of God, Tsalach, when he forces entry, the human subject achieves the intended result.
Samson defeats the lion. David is established as the anointed king.
Yes, but they achieve it not by their own inherent strength, but because of the irresistible nature of the Spirit's advance.
I want to push back on that a little bit, or at least play devil's advocate for a second.
Sure, go ahead.
Because that completely upends how our culture thinks about success. We think of success as something we generate from the inside out.
We definitely do. We are very focused on self-determination.
Right. We read the right books, we wake up at 5 in the morning, we hustle, we manifest our goals, and eventually we succeed. But in this basic grammatical stem, success is something that invades you from the outside.
That is an accurate way to frame the tension. The individual becomes the vessel for the Spirit's momentum.
The human is just the instrument being used by the force.
Yes, the goal is reached because the force pushing toward it cannot be thwarted by any earthly barrier. Whether that barrier is a roaring lion or a Philistine army, the penetrating force breaks through.
But sudden, violent intervention does not explain the whole picture of human life. We do not walk around having lions rush at us every day.
Thankfully, no.
What happens when the momentum isn't a flash in the pan, but a lifelong reality? The language of sudden invasion is just one facet.
That brings us to the other major grammatical structure for this word. The Hebrew language possesses another stem, which shifts the meaning from a sudden, explosive event to a continuous, sustained reality.
And what stem is that?
The Hebrew language uses the Hiphil stem to convey this. If the simple, basic Qal stem means to force entry or to succeed in a sudden moment, the Hiphil stem is causative.
Causative, so it causes the action to happen over time.
Yes, it means to make something a success or to cause to prosper over a duration.
And the lexicon lists 40 occurrences of this specific causative stem, right?
It does, showing a massive concentration in the book of Genesis, the book of Daniel, and the historical chronicles.
And there is a specific pairing the lexicon points out here. The verb Tsalach in this causative stem is repeatedly paired with the Hebrew noun derek.
Yes, Derek, which translates to way or path or journey.
This pairing is essential for grasping the ancient worldview. In this framework, success is not viewed as an inherent personality trait.
Right, you do not take a personality test to find out if you are an achiever.
Nor is success the product of random luck, favorable market conditions, or having the right connections. Success is caused.
It is the result of a sovereign hand ensuring that a specific path reaches its decreed destination.
Let's look at Genesis 24, which the sources highlight repeatedly. This is the story of Abraham sending his senior servant back to his homeland to find a wife for his son, Isaac.
The stakes in this narrative are incredibly high.
Think about it. Abraham is ancient. The promise of an entire nation rests on Isaac having an heir. The servant arrives at a well in a foreign land, completely unsure of how to proceed.
He is out of his depth.
Totally. He has no dating apps, no matchmaking service, no local contacts. He is relying entirely on divine intervention to ensure this massive historical turning point happens correctly.
And pay attention to the exact language the servant uses when he prays by the well. He asks God to make his way prosper.
So he uses the Hiphil stem there.
Yes, the Hebrew phrasing uses the causative Hiphil stem of Tsalach with the noun derek. He is literally asking, cause the path I am on to reach its goal.
That is beautiful. He is asking for the sovereign force to push the path forward.
And later, when he meets Rebecca, realizes she is the right woman, and is recounting the incredible string of events to her family, he says, "The Lord has made my way successful."
God is the active agent causing the progress of the journey. We see a similar construction in Joshua 1.8, don't we?
We do. God tells Joshua, who is about to lead the people into hostile territory, to meditate on the law day and night.
And then it says, you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success.
The causative action is linked directly to obedience to the divine word. The path reaches its end when it aligns with the sovereign instruction.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's look at the story of Joseph in Genesis chapter 39.
This is a crucial text for understanding this word.
The lexicon notes that Joseph is explicitly called an ish matzliach, a successful man.
He is. The text is very clear about that designation.
Wait, stop. I am sorry, but I have to push back hard on this. This is the most shocking use of the word in the entire lexicon.
It definitely catches modern readers off guard.
If I am rotting in an Egyptian prison or walking across a desert in chains, I am not feeling successful. Joseph is a teenager who has been betrayed by his own jealous brothers.
His situation is objectively horrific.
They threw him to a pit, debated killing him, and then sold him to human traffickers. He is marched to Egypt and purchased as a piece of property by Potiphar.
He is stripped of everything.
He is a literal slave. He has been stripped of his family, his freedom, his dignity, and his homeland. And yet the biblical text looks at this enslaved foreigner sweeping floors in a pagan country and calls him a successful man.
It is a jarring description.
Doesn't calling a slave successful border on toxic positivity? Like, how did the ancient Israelites actually stomach that description?
It sort of shatters our contemporary definition entirely. It feels like a massive contradiction to us because in our context, success is defined purely by accumulation.
Right. We define it by wealth, status, autonomy, comfort, and positive visible metrics.
And Joseph possesses absolutely none of those things. He is at the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy. He owns nothing, not even his own body.
So how can the text call him that?
The text unapologetically says he is an ish matzliach because of one singular overriding factor. Genesis 39:2 explicitly states, "The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man."
Oh, I see. The success is inextricably tied to the presence of God. It has absolutely nothing to do with Joseph's external circumstances or his bank account.
The theological framework here demands our full attention. True success in the biblical Hebrew mindset means that the sovereign plan is advancing.
Joseph's path, his derrick, is reaching its decreed destination.
Yes. God's purpose for Joseph, which will eventually involve saving entire nations from a catastrophic famine and preserving the lineage of the promise, is moving forward like a penetrating force.
And the fact that this path currently runs through the agonizing, brutal reality of slavery does not negate the success.
Not at all. The success is happening beneath the surface of the visible circumstances. The invisible force is breaking through the barriers of betrayal and enslavement.
And it gets even wilder, because Joseph is falsely accused of assault by Potiphar's wife. He goes from being a slave in a reasonably nice house to a prisoner in a dark royal dungeon.
He falls even further down the ladder. It seems like the path is completely destroyed.
And what does the text say in Genesis 39:23? The warden of the prison paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed.
There is the Hiphil stem of Tsalach again. The Lord caused it to prosper, even in a dungeon.
The penetrating force of God's will cannot be stopped by a prison door or iron chains. The path advances regardless of the geography.
This forces the listener to evaluate their own life through a radically different lens.
It really does. You could be experiencing terrible outward hardship, facing immense limitations, dealing with illness or financial collapse, and yet,
if the sovereign hand is with you, causing your path to align with his decreed end, you are, by definition, experiencing ultimate success.
I'm going to be honest, that is a heavy reality to sit with. It completely flips the script on how we evaluate our own lives.
We are so conditioned to look at the visible markers.
We look at our job titles, our followers, or the square footage of our homes to gauge our success. But the text is telling us to look exclusively at the presence of God and the advancement of his purposes.
This raises an important question, one that agonizingly confronted the ancient prophets.
Because if we accept that God is the one who causes success, we run into a major issue, right?
Yes. If God guarantees that the path reaches its end, how do we explain the reality of the geopolitical world around us? How do we explain the blatant, visible success of those who actively oppose him?
It is the problem of evil wrapped in a linguistic puzzle. And the focal point of this tension is found in the cry of the prophet Jeremiah.
Jeremiah 12:1 is one of the most raw, honest verses in all of ancient literature.
Jeremiah brings a literal lawsuit against God. He says, "Righteous are you, O Lord, when I complain to you, yet I would plead my case before you."
He is laying it all out there.
And then he asks the question that has haunted humanity for millennia. He asks, why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why does the derrick of the wicked Tsalach?
Put yourself in Jeremiah's shoes for a minute. He is looking at the reality of his day. He sees corrupt kings within his own nation.
And he sees violent empires outside of it.
Exactly. He sees empires like Babylon amassing massive armies, amassing wealth, crushing the vulnerable, and burning cities to the ground.
And Jeremiah knows his vocabulary. He knows that Tsalach implies a path reaching its intended goal because of a driving causative force.
So he is essentially asking God a terrifying question. He is saying, are you the one driving their success?
Why are these ruthless dictators penetrating barriers and achieving their goals while the righteous suffer?
It is the ultimate tension. How can a sovereign, just God permit the wicked to experience forward momentum?
If Tsalach means that God caused success, is God causing the Babylonians to succeed in their evil?
To understand the biblical answer to this, the lexicon points us to a fascinating alternative translation of the root Tsalach.
Okay, what is this alternative translation?
In several places in the prophets, particularly in the books of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, the word is translated not as to succeed or to prosper, but as to be useful or to be fit for a function.
Usefulness. That is a very different angle than prosperity or military victory.
It is, but it connects perfectly to the idea of reaching a goal. Think about a physical tool.
Like a hammer or a saw.
Sure, a hammer. A tool is successful if it performs the specific function it was designed to do. A hammer succeeds when it drives a nail into a board.
If the handle breaks off and it cannot drive a nail, it is useless. It fails to reach its goal.
Now apply this concept of function and usefulness to the prophetic texts. Look at Jeremiah chapter 13. God commands Jeremiah to perform a highly unusual, almost absurd prophetic act.
Right, the story of the linen loincloth. And we have to talk about how bizarre this is.
It is very visceral.
God tells Jeremiah to buy a linen loincloth, essentially ancient underwear, a garment worn directly against the skin in the sweltering Middle Eastern heat, and wear it.
But he is strictly commanded not to wash it.
Then, after wearing this sweaty garment, God tells him to take it, travel all the way to the Euphrates River, and bury it in a damp cleft of the rock.
It is a long, arduous task for a very strange burial. Then, after many days pass, God tells Jeremiah to go all the way back to the river and dig it up.
And what does Jeremiah find? The text says the linen loincloth was completely ruined. It was good for nothing.
The Hebrew phrase is literally, it did not Tsalach for anything. It was no longer useful.
It could not fulfill its intended function as a piece of clothing. The disgust factor is high here. You are digging up rotting, muddy, ancient underwear.
But God explains the metaphor clearly to Jeremiah. He says, "This evil people who refuse to hear my words, who stubbornly follow their own heart, shall be like this loincloth, which is good for nothing."
Ezekiel uses the exact same linguistic concept in chapter 15, doesn't he? But with a different agricultural image.
He talks about the wood of a vine. Vine wood is not like oak or cedar. You cannot build a house with it.
You cannot craft a piece of furniture or carve a peg from it. It is too soft, twisted, and brittle.
Its only function, its only reason for existing is to bear grapes.
But Ezekiel asks a hypothetical question. He asks, what if the vine wood is thrown into the fire and its ends are charred? Is it then useful for any work?
The Hebrew text asks, will it Tsalach for any work? The answer is obviously no. It has become utterly useless.
So how does this resolve the massive theological tension of Jeremiah's question about the wicked prospering? How does rotting underwear answer the problem of evil empires winning wars?
It contrasts temporary apparent success with the concept of ultimate usefulness in the grand design of the Creator.
The wicked might seem to advance in the short term. They might swing their swords, conquer a city, or a massive fortune.
But like the buried loincloth, which represents a rebellious people cutting themselves off from their source of life, they fail to reach the true goal of their existence.
Their rebellion leads to a state of total inability to function within God's intended design.
They become completely useless for their intended function. The prosperity of the wicked is a mirage.
It looks like forward momentum. It looks like they are breaking through barriers.
But it is actually the rotting of the loincloth in the damp dirt. It is the charring of the vine branch in the fire.
They are achieving temporal, fleeting goals while simultaneously failing at the singular cosmic goal for which they were created.
And this paints a stark, uncompromising picture of human inability. Human rebellion naturally leads to a state of being completely unfit for the divine purpose.
The ruined garment cannot repair its own threads. The burnt vine cannot produce grapes from ashes.
This total inability to function on a spiritual level requires an external intervention. It requires a grace that is effective enough to bestow purpose where there was only uselessness.
Which means If human rebellion leads to total uselessness, and if our own human efforts to succeed are easily ruined, where can true permanent success be found?
We have to look away from human agency entirely. We have to look at the decrees of God.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the lexicon directs our attention to the book of Isaiah, specifically chapters 53 and 55.
These are majestic, sweeping texts that deal with the absolute certainty of God's redemptive plan.
In Isaiah 53, the famous passage about the suffering servant, verse 10 says that the will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand.
The Hebrew word for will or pleasure is chifetz, and it is paired with our word, Tsalach. God's sovereign desire will break through. It will reach its destination.
And then Isaiah 55.1 of them gives us perhaps the most soaring poetic description of this concept in the entire canon.
God is speaking, and he compares his word to the rain and the snow that fall from heaven to water the earth.
He says, "So shall my word be that goes out from my mouth. It shall not return to me empty, but it shall accomplish that which I purpose, and shall succeed in the thing for which I sent it."
The verb translated shall succeed is Tsalach. We see the absolute culmination of the entire semantic development right here in this verse.
God's spoken word is described as an active, living agent, almost like a military unit or a penetrating force sent out on a specific mission.
When God speaks, his word enters reality, breaks through all human resistance, shatters all historical barriers, and forcefully accomplishes the decreed destination.
It is an unstoppable force. Think about the difference between our words and God's words. Human words are just wishes.
We make plans, we write strategic goals for the quarter, we make promises to our spouses, but our words have no inherent capacity to enforce their own reality.
We say, "I'm going to build a successful business," but a global recession hits. Or we get a terrible medical diagnosis and our word fails. It falls to the ground empty.
But when God speaks, the word itself contains the irresistible force necessary to ensure its own success.
This absolute certainty of the divine decree stands in sharp, intentional contrast to other Hebrew words associated with success.
Yes, the lexicon specifically notes two other words in the broader semantic field that we need to examine.
What are those words?
They are Qal and Hiphil. These are words found heavily in the wisdom literature, like the Book of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes.
Let's break those down because comparing synonyms helps us understand the unique flavor of Tsalach. What is the nuance of Qal?
Qal primarily means to act with prudence, insight, or comprehension, which leads to a good result.
So it is the kind of success that comes from making wise choices, learning from past experience, and applying good judgment to a situation.
You study hard for an exam, you make wise financial investments, you speak carefully rather than in anger, and therefore you experience Qal. You have a successful outcome based on your own prudent action.
Okay, that sounds like a lot of the advice we get today. And what about the other word, tushia?
Tushia is a fascinating word that scholars debate constantly, but it generally vacillates between meaning sound wisdom, cunning, or prudence, and the results or success that come directly from that cunning.
It is about having the practical know-how, the street smarts, the ability to maneuver through complex, difficult situations and come out on top.
Right, it is very pragmatic.
So what does this all mean for us? We have these words for human wisdom, prudence, and cunning, and then we have Tsalach.
The contrast is striking.
How does this ancient vocabulary compare to our modern obsession with what we call life hacks or success formulas? You cannot scroll through the internet or listen to an audio show without seeing someone selling a masterclass on the 5 prudent steps to guarantee wealth, health, and happiness.
Human wisdom, prudence, and cunning certainly have their place. The Book of Proverbs is full of them, and they are generally true principles for living.
Hard work usually pays off. Foolish, impulsive decisions usually lead to ruin.
But the biblical text makes a massive, non-negotiable distinction. Human prudence, which is Qal, and human cunning, which is tushia, can still fail.
You can do absolutely everything right, apply all the wisdom in the world, eat perfectly, invest perfectly, and still lose everything to a famine, a war, an unpredictable market crash, or a sudden betrayal.
Human success is always conditional. It is fragile.
But Tsalach, when applied to God's word and God's decree, is completely unconditional. It does not depend on the stock market or human cooperation or favorable weather patterns.
It anchors ultimate certainty entirely in God's sovereign decree. God does not need to use a life hack. He speaks, and the reality alters to accommodate the word.
When you realize that God's word operates with the penetrating force of an axe-splitting wood or the sudden rush of a river breaking its banks, you realize that the foundation of reality is not chaotic.
No, it is moving steadily, forcefully toward an absolute guaranteed conclusion.
That is a staggering realization. It shifts your feet onto solid rock. It is a completely different universe than the one where we are all just frantically trying to hack our way to temporary prosperity, hoping a storm doesn't blow our house of cards down.
It provides an immense sense of stability for the believer. The path reaches its end not because the traveler is incredibly strong, cunning, or prudent, but because the path itself is being driven forward by the one who laid the stones.
We have covered massive ground today. We started by looking at a primitive, intensely physical action, an axe splitting a log, forcing an entry, breaking a solid barrier.
We watched that concrete concept evolve in the ancient mind into the idea of a sudden, explosive rush.
Like a river breaching its banks or the external Spirit of God overwhelming a human vessel like Samson to achieve a violently sudden goal.
We saw how the grammatical stems shifted it from a sudden event to a continuous reality.
Where the sovereign hand of God is the active cause of a path prospering, even if that path leads straight into the dark horrors of an Egyptian prison.
We examined the agonizing tension of the wicked appearing to succeed, only to realize that true success is measured by usefulness within the divine design.
We saw that rebellion leads only to the tragic, disgusting uselessness of a rotting garment buried by a river.
And finally, we contrasted the fragility of human wisdom, prudence, and modern life hacks with the unstoppable, penetrating reality of God's spoken word, which guarantees its own victory.
We have completely dismantled the modern, clean dictionary definition of success and replaced it with a vision of sovereign momentum.
For you listening to this, I think the challenge is to evaluate your own internal definition of success. What are you actually chasing with your life?
Are you exhausting yourself in pursuit of the outward, temporary prosperity of those who are rebelling against their Creator?
Or are you seeking the kind of success that comes exclusively from God's presence, the reality of His hand actively causing your specific path to reach His intended destination, regardless of how bleak the visible circumstances might appear?
That is the question you have to answer. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final, completely new thought to consider on your own.
A parting thought to chew on.
We started with the image of opening a dictionary and expecting a clean, painless definition, only to find a messy, aggressive reality. If Tsalach fundamentally means a penetrating force, a breaking through, a shattering of barriers to reach a goal.
Could it be that the moments in your life where you feel the most broken into, the most interrupted,
The moments where your careful plans are completely shattered by circumstances outside your control.
could it be that those are actually the very moments the sovereign hand of God is actively moving in, breaking down your fragile human structures, and making you truly successful?
It changes everything about how you view an interruption.
It really does.
Keep thinking on that.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.